Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to do some more Trek explaining. I want to talk about different timelines, the future of Star Trek, how we can explain away all kinds of contradictions, and by the way, I'm doing all of this mostly for fun. This is not my attempt to defend any of the bad decisions made in this franchise. This is my attempt to fix all of that and hopefully to move forward and to finally have a proper Star Trek series set in the far future and to leave all the nonsense behind. And so I want to make a few videos talking about my ideas for the Picard series, what I think should happen in that series, how it should be done, and I don't mind if they steal my ideas and do it as long as we get an actually good Star Trek series. I don't mind if anyone takes any of my ideas, so I hope they do. So I plan to make a few videos on that, but first of all I want to cover this topic of the two different futures that we saw in the older Star Trek shows, namely the one we saw in the last episode of TNG, called All Good Things, in which we saw Picard in the future. And even though that timeline was basically erased because Picard saw that future and so he did a lot of changes, but I still think a lot of the things that we saw in that future still have some relevance. That's why it is important to cover all of that and not just forget about that timeline as if it never happened. I do think we can take a lot of interesting things from that timeline, and especially since we saw very similar futures in all the main Star Trek shows. We saw a very similar future in the Deep Space Nine episode called The Visitor in season 4 and in the last episode of Voyager. And so in all the three major Star Trek shows, Deep Space Nine, TNG and Voyager, we saw a very similar future. In each of those events it was a different timeline which eventually got cancelled because someone went back in time and changed it. And yet that future was always very similar in all three of those series, probably because they simply reused the same props, the same uniforms, and so that's why it all looks so similar. So now I'm going to cover the big differences between the future that we saw in the Star Trek movies and the future that we saw in the last episode of TNG, which is very similar to the future we saw in the Deep Space Nine episode The Visitor and the last episode of Voyager, and so I will also mention little events or references from those episodes as well. So first of all, we know that the Enterprise D survived in that future because we saw it. It was retrofitted, but it was still the same ship, the Enterprise D, so that means it was never destroyed in a battle with the Duras sisters like happened in the movies. We also saw that the old Picard was attending to the grapevines of his family, so presumably he also lives there, and I kind of suspect that his family probably didn't die in this timeline. I think if he knew that they are going to die in the future, he would definitely have taken measures to prevent that. Just like he told the rest of his crew about that future to prevent certain events from happening, similarly I don't think he would let his family die if he knew it's going to happen. And so I strongly believe that his family did not die in that original timeline that Q showed him. And at some point later in his life, probably after his brother died, he moved back to Earth and retired there, maybe to be closer to his nephew, who probably was still alive. Also, I think if his family died in a fire, if their house was destroyed, like happened in Generations, he probably wouldn't want to live there, so I doubt we would see him tending those grapevines in the future if that's the place that his whole family died. And so I think that event never happened in this future, and maybe that explains why the Enterprise wasn't destroyed, because remember in the beginning of the movie Generations, he got the message about his family dying, and that caused him to be very emotionally unstable, and that's why he removed himself from all his duties. He let Riker do the whole investigation, and he secluded himself in his quarters, and so he was extremely distracted because of this whole event. And then later when Soran wanted to see him, he went and met him and agreed to his request to go to that observatory, which started the whole chain of events in the movie, which ended with the Enterprise getting destroyed. And so I think if not for his family dying, he would have been much more clear-headed. He probably would not have trusted Soran so easily, because remember there was that scene in which he talked with him and Soran appealed to his emotions, telling him that time is the fire in which we burn and all of that, and that had a strong effect on Picard because of what just happened to his family, because they all burned to death. That's what made him extremely susceptible to Soran's words. So if not for that event, he probably would not have agreed to allow Soran to go to that observatory, and maybe he would have talked with Guinan, and maybe she would have told him about Soran, and then he would have simply arrested him. That would have prevented the Enterprise from getting destroyed, because it was only destroyed thanks to Soran, who devised that plan with Geordi's visor, which allowed the Duras sisters to gain the shield frequency and destroy the ship. And so if Picard simply arrested Soran, none of it would have happened, the Enterprise would have survived, and the Duras sisters wouldn't have a chance against the Enterprise and would probably just run away and hide. And also Captain Kirk would have stayed in the Nexus because he never would have met Picard, who convinced him to go out. Another possible change this could have caused is that since Picard never met Kirk, then Kirk never convinced Picard to never give up the captain's chair. So presumably Picard took that advice, and that's why he insisted to remain a captain of the Enterprise as long as he possibly could. Up until the very last movie, Nemesis, we still saw him as the captain. And I suspect in the original timeline that we saw in the end of TNG, probably Picard did accept promotions, he probably did become an admiral and later an ambassador and later retired, so he wasn't a captain as long as he was in the movies. So that's another big difference which I will use later to try to explain a few things. Another big difference between these two timelines is what happened with Worf. We know that Worf moved to Deep Space Nine only because of the destruction of the Enterprise, so presumably if the Enterprise wasn't destroyed, he would have stayed there much longer and would never have went to Deep Space Nine. And if he never went to Deep Space Nine, he never would have rescued Martok from the Jem'Hadar prison, and that means Gowron would have stayed the leader of the Klingons much longer, and we know that Gowron is not exactly the best leader. Martok would not have been the ruler, he would have died in the Jem'Hadar prison, and so the Empire probably wouldn't be as friendly as it would be under Martok. And for simplicity's sake, let's give names to these two timelines. So let's call the one we saw in All Good Things Timeline A. Let's say that was the original timeline before Picard changed it, and so that was Timeline A. And Timeline B is what we saw happening in the movies and in Deep Space Nine and Voyager, because all of that happened after Picard changed the Future A. So that's how I will distinguish these two timelines. So in Future A, Enterprise D was never destroyed. Worf never left the Enterprise to Deep Space Nine. He stayed on the Enterprise much longer, possibly, and probably had much more serious relationship with Troy, which caused some tensions between him and Riker. And at some point, Troy somehow died, and that's probably when Worf left the Enterprise and probably went into Klingon politics, because we hear that he became a governor and a member of the High Council of the Klingons. And we even heard about that in the Deep Space Nine episode The Visitor, which also showed us the same future in which Worf also was a member of the Klingon High Council. But he was not the ruler of the Klingons. That was probably either still Gowron or maybe someone involved with the Duras family, and the Empire was much more aggressive against the Federation and other powers. Also, because Worf never went to Deep Space Nine, that means Sisko would not have discovered the Klingons' plans to attack Cardassia in Season 4 of Deep Space Nine, so he would not have been able to prevent that. So most likely the Klingons conquered Cardassia, and as was mentioned in that episode, such a big victory would have made the Klingons want to go back to their old ways, and would have made them much more aggressive again. They would have wanted to conquer even more powers after finishing with the Cardassians. It's also likely the Dominion War would not have happened in that future. The fake Martok changeling was probably going to be exposed anyway at some point, because that was done mostly by Odo, not by Worf. So they probably would have gotten rid of him anyway. And without Cardassia being their foothold, the Dominion probably wouldn't try to invade the Alpha Quadrant. And without being able to use Cardassia as their foothold, the Dominion probably wouldn't invade the Alpha Quadrant, especially if the Klingons were so aggressive and attacking everybody. They would have probably postponed those plans, and by then the Founders were probably sick because of that virus by Section 31, and so that would have postponed the Dominion War maybe indefinitely, and so probably it wouldn't have happened. That's also what we saw in the Deep Space Nine episode The Visitor. We saw that the Dominion War never happened when the Klingons became much more aggressive and they took over Deep Space Nine. It's possible they also mined the entire Bajoran system as they wanted to do in Season 4 of Deep Space Nine. Most likely after defeating Cardassia, the Klingons would have moved heavily around the Bajoran system and maybe fortified the wormhole, so it would have been impossible for the Dominion to invade. So in a strange way, the Klingons actually would have prevented the Dominion War, but they would be waging their own wars against other powers. They would be much more hostile toward the Federation, and at some point we know that they invaded the Romulans. It was specifically mentioned in Timeline A that the Romulan Empire no longer exists, that it is being ruled by the Klingons. And the Klingons and the Federation are in bad relations as well, maybe as a result. Maybe because the Federation didn't like the way the Klingons keep conquering everyone, and so that caused the tensions with the Federation as well. And so Romulus is under Klingon control in that future, and also there was no mention of any kind of supernova. So why is that? If that was a natural phenomenon, that would have happened anyway, so maybe in that future Spock managed to save Romulus in time to prevent it from happening, but I don't like that theory. I actually prefer the theory that the supernova was actually not a natural occurrence, that maybe it was a deliberate attack maybe by Section 31. In any event, we know that the supernova explosion didn't happen in Timeline A, so let's now move to Timeline B, which we saw in the movies and Deep Space Nine. We know that the Enterprise D was destroyed, the Dura sisters also died. Picard met Kirk, who told him never to give up the captain's chair. And Worf moved to Deep Space Nine because he lost the Enterprise. And because of that he was able to save Martok from the Dominion prison, and he later killed Gowron and made Martok the leader of the Empire, and Martok was much more friendly toward the Federation, and probably he wouldn't even attack the Romulans. And also the Dominion War did happen in this timeline, and that greatly weakened the Klingon Empire, and so they would not be in a position to launch any new wars in the near future. And that point was specifically mentioned by Section 31, that the Klingons would be too weak to wage war on anyone, and so that only leaves the Romulans as the only big threat to Federation security. And that is why I suspect that Section 31 were the ones behind that supernova explosion. I think they somehow did it deliberately, maybe they tried to make it look like a natural event, but it was a deliberate attack to eliminate the Romulans, who they viewed as the only real danger to the Federation. After the Romulans are gone, and all the other major powers are greatly weakened, the Federation would be in a far better position strategically, and so the Federation remains without any real foes in its area. And the reason they didn't do that in Timeline A was because Romulus was conquered by the Klingons. The Klingons had a war with the Romulans, which weakened them both even more, and so Section 31 never had the reason to destroy Romulus, because it was conquered by the Klingons anyway, and both of them were even weaker, so they didn't have a reason to do that. But in Timeline B, because under Martok the Klingons never attacked the Romulans, that's why Section 31 viewed the Romulans as the only big danger left to the Federation, and that's why they hatched that plan to deliberately cause a supernova close to their planet to try to wipe them out, to get rid of the only real big enemy of the Federation. As for all the events with Shinzon, I guess he existed in both timelines, but he probably was defeated in both of them since Picard was still alive in the future after all those events. That means Shinzon could not have been alive because he needed all of Picard's blood to survive, and so since Picard was still alive in that future, that means Shinzon was dead. So because the events of Timeline A never happened, because Picard changed the past by telling his crew about the future, there is no real reason to debate any of those events except the event of the death of Picard's family, because I think that was the main focal point which split off to a different timeline, because in a strange way, because his family died, that caused the destruction of the Enterprise, which was better for the Federation. On the other hand, it did cause the Dominion War, and also indirectly caused the destruction of Romulus. So it's up for debate which timeline is better, but it all started with the event of Picard's family died. And so why exactly did that happen? Logically, it would have made more sense the other way around. If he would have known they would die and would have warned them, then it would be logical. But apparently they were not supposed to die in Timeline A, and maybe because he did something differently, maybe that somehow indirectly caused it. He did say in Generations that he was going to meet his family, so maybe because he saw his future in Timeline A, that made him more homesick, and that's why he made contact with his family and made plans with them. Maybe because of that they decided to change something in their house, and maybe that caused the fire which killed them, and maybe Picard found out about it and it made him feel guilty about the whole thing somehow, because he knew that that was not supposed to happen. So maybe he felt responsible because he knew it could be a result of him telling his crew about the future. Maybe somehow indirectly it caused like a butterfly effect that affected his own family. That could also explain why he never tried to fix it when he was in the Nexus, because technically it was said he can leave the Nexus to any point in time he wants, and yet he didn't bother to go back and save his family. Maybe it's because he knew from his own experience that by changing the past he might cause an even bigger catastrophe to happen. So maybe he knows that because he warned his own crew about all the things that happen in Timeline A, such as Troy dying, so maybe Troy didn't die because of that, but his own family died as a result. And so maybe now he's afraid to change anything again, because then maybe even more people would die. So that's one possible way to explain it, and it would explain why he feels so responsible for that event, and that's why he was so shocked and so distracted, and that caused Soran and the Dura sisters to destroy the Enterprise, and also that resulted in him meeting Captain Kirk, which convinced him to stay a captain. And so it's possible he never became an ambassador in this new timeline. So all of this is leading me to talk about the new Picard series and the kind of stuff I think should be done in that show. It was said by Patrick Stewart that he's going to play a different Picard, a Picard who suffers from the consequences of his life, and so maybe something really bad happened to him later on as well. It was also mentioned that the destruction of Romulus will be dealt with in the new TV show. So my theory is this: because in the very last movie Nemesis we saw that the Romulans and the Federation were about to initiate peace talks after the whole Shinzon thing, that maybe finally the Federation and Romulans are going to make some kind of a peace treaty. This was after the Dominion War in which they were allies, and so it does make sense. And so what if Picard was personally responsible for pursuing that peace treaty? Maybe he's the one who led that whole peace process. Maybe he spent a lot of time and effort in building the bridges between the Federation and the Romulans, and suddenly Romulus gets destroyed by a supernova, so that must have been very devastating for him, especially if he was close to achieving a true peace between the Romulans and the Federation. And maybe he discovers that it was caused by Section 31, so he knows that his own fellow humans are the ones responsible for this genocide, and so that made him kind of lose hope in humanity, maybe lose hope in the Federation. And maybe this whole event actually became public somehow. Maybe the role of Section 31 was exposed to the public, and that could have caused the collapse of the Federation. Maybe planets wanted to leave the Federation after they discovered the existence of this evil secret organization that is acting on behalf of Federation interest and is committing genocide and other evil acts. That could have caused a breakup of the Federation. And so with all of that happening, maybe Picard himself kind of lost hope in the Federation or Starfleet and decided to retire and go live somewhere else. Maybe not on Earth since his family was killed, so maybe he didn't want to see that old house. So maybe he went off to some distant part of the galaxy to pursue his archaeology hobby, to dig up some ruins in some distant planet, and that might be where we find him in the beginning of the Picard show. Someone comes looking for him and he doesn't want to come back. Maybe he doesn't believe in the Federation anymore because he discovered what they did to the Romulans, and maybe he's told that the Federation is breaking apart, that planets want to leave the Federation, and that's why he's needed for his skills as a diplomat to try to save the Federation. So maybe that will be in the new Picard show, and that is something I will discuss in more videos in the future. So let me know what you think in the comments below and we can discuss it in the comment section. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope to see you next time. Bye bye.